Good morning, church. For those you may not know me, my name is Robert Williams, and I'm the assisting pastor here at the church. I do a little bit of everything. The jack of all trades and master of none, they say. Anyway, as Pastor Sean is away this week, he's asked me to speak to you this morning, and I really didn't have any kind of a topic or agenda assigned or anything, and so I began just a couple of weeks ago actually realizing, hey, this is this Sunday, and Lord, what would you want me to talk about? And as I began to pray and just kind of meditate on things that are in my heart or my life or things that I feel I could talk to you about, and I want to just tell you this morning about Joseph. I think we all should have biblical characters that we look to as models. And of course, Christ alone is the perfect model. He is the one that should be our first and foremost, that we are trying to imitate, that we are trying to live our life and pattern our lives after. But there are many men and women, and let me put this parentheses here, not that I'm a politically correct person, but when I'm talking about men this morning, I'm talking about mankind, humankind, people, everyone, okay? So if I say man, I mean everybody. There are several that stick out to me that I have kind of looked to and studied more than others, but probably Joseph is one that I identify with the most. I think because of a lot of the things that he patterned his life after that I aspire to be like in my lifestyle and in my management. I'm going to go ahead and put that word out there of my life and in ministry as to how we respond to people, how we deal with situations in our lives. Joseph is a good example to follow. So I want to start by giving you some background. I always like to do this, to go backwards first and then go forward. And so I want to talk about Jacob first. Jacob was, and we've talked a little bit about Jacob and Esau through the sovereignty of God and how God chose Jacob before he was born and said, Jacob I will bless and love, and Esau I will despise and not. And so that was a sovereign thing that God did, to choose Jacob and to set him to be the father of the nation. Of course, Abraham, we know, was the father of many nations, and we saw that through Ishmael, and the descendants of Ishmael are a whole nation of Abraham. And then, of course, Isaac, and then Isaac's two sons, Jacob and Esau. Of course, Esau had a whole branch of another nation, and I'm not going to try to identify who all those people are, but they're out there in the Middle East. And then we see Jacob, and here's a breakdown of Jacob's descendants. And most of us remember the story how Jacob went to his uncle's house to find a wife, and he found one that he really liked a lot, Rachel. He loved Rachel, and he wanted Rachel to be his wife. But his uncle Laban deceived him. And I want you to remember that Jacob was named as a deceiver. Remember, Jacob deceived his father and his brother and had his mother play a part in it. So Jacob was not necessarily a good guy. Okay? And God uses folks that aren't necessarily perfect. A lot of these guys, folks that we look at in the Bible, they had their flaws. They had their weaknesses. They had sins in their lives. Yet God chose, in spite of those things, to use them and redeem them through it. So anyway, you know the story. Jacob was deceived by his uncle, and when they got married and he went into his wife, he found out that it was the other sister, Leah. And so he had to work. He worked 7 years for her, and then he had to work another 7 years to get the one he really wanted, which was Rachel, the one that he loved the most. But I'll put it this way, here he is stuck with Leah, and so he's got two wives, And they began having children. And, of course, Leah was having babies one after the other. She had, and you see them numbered here, 1, 2, 3, 4, down to Judah. Leah had babies, and Rachel wasn't having any babies. And as was a custom among people in that culture, Rachel hadn't had any babies. Of course, remember Sarah did this with Abraham. She gave her handmaiden to her husband Jacob to lie with her so that the handmaiden would produce a baby for her. Okay? And so that first one that was born of the handmaiden was Dan. And then they did it again, and there was another baby, Naphtali, number 6. And then, lo and behold, Leah decides, well, I'm tired of having babies for a while. I think I'll let him have my handmaiden. And so Jacob had Leah's handmaiden, Zilpah, and she had Gad and Asher. And then Leah had some more of her own, Issachar and Zebulun. That's down to number 10 sons that Jacob has fathered with 4 women. Is that a messed up family or what? Got 2 wives and 2 concubines and 10 children by the 4 of them. Messed up. And lo and behold, Rachel gets pregnant after all these years. And Jacob's getting old by now and tired, I'm sure. So Rachel has this baby, and he's Jacob's instant favorite because Rachel was his favorite wife, his love of his life. And here she has given him a son, and he just falls in love with this boy Joseph. And he instantly becomes his favorite out of 11 children. And of course, then we see that Rachel goes on to have one more, Benjamin, number 12. So I put all of that out here for you to understand that Joseph, who we're really going to be the one we're going to talk about, he did not come from perfect circumstances. He did not have perfect examples in his life, and the family he grew up with was a mess. And there was all this deception. They were constantly, remember Jacob started it, and then his uncle did it, and the 2 sisters, the wives, were constantly deceiving and planting all these plots with their kids. And if you read starting in Genesis 30 through about 40, you're going to see all this stuff. And then these boys, as they grow up, they got into all this stuff. And then there was a couple of girls born in there. You can see their names are in red. Dinah is the one that we know the story of Dinah. And that whole story I won't get into, but it's all in there that these boys were just constantly in trouble and stirring up problems and having issues. So that brings us up Genesis 37, and this is where the story of Joseph really begins. We begin to learn something about Joseph. He's 17 years old, and his father doesn't send him the first time. He just comes to his father and reports back on what his brothers are doing. And like I said, his brothers hardly ever are up to good. They're always up to some kind of no good or whatever. And Joseph was a snitch, really. I mean, that's what we would call him today, or tattletale. Went back to his dad and telling him everything that the brothers are doing. But still, Jacob loved Joseph, and it kind of went to Joseph's head just a little bit that his dad loved him so much. And his dad gives him this coat of many colors. And of course, some of the translations don't just say that it was many colors, they say it was ornate. And so I can imagine that it had like embroideries on it, different threads of embroidery, and maybe even some jewels or sparkles or something. It was a fabulous coat. It was, just really fancy. And Joseph kind of wore it with a little bit of pride, I think, because he sort of rubbed his brother's nose in it a little bit. And then he has this dream. And he dreams that these sheaves of grain, there's 10 or 11 of them, and they all come in front of him and bow down to him. And instantly is interpreted that means his brothers are going to bow down. I mean, he tells them, and again, he's a little bit letting pride and something, develop in him that needs to be dealt with, I believe. And again, where he came from, it's not surprising that he would rebel a little bit and try to rise up out of those circumstances somewhat, and that he was very happy to be favored by his father. He was proud of it. Then he has another dream, similar. This time the stars and the sun and the moon come and bow before him. And he tells this to his father and his brothers. And then it kind of makes his father upset. You mean even your mother and I are going to bow down to you? And so his father kind of tries to put him back in his place and let him know that, I'm still Jacob. I'm still Israel at this point. God has changed Jacob's name and had begun referring to him. If you look in the scriptures, he was referred to at this point as Israel, which became the name of the nation. So I set the stage here for, Joseph was a little bit flawed. He wasn't into the gross sin and all the bad things his brothers were into, but he still wasn't a perfect child. He was not a perfect child. He was a little bit stuck up. Brings us to 39. So the sons take the flocks and they go, it's about 75 miles away, grazing the flocks, searching for green grass and water to be able to feed the sheep and the goats and to care for them. And so Joseph and Benjamin are not allowed to go or kept at home for whatever reason, but yet he's getting old enough that his father decides to send him to go check on them. And so Joseph goes to check on his brothers, and he travels this long distance to where they are, and he begins to inquire. And then some people say, well, no, they left here a few days ago. They're about 10 miles west of here. So he had to go a little bit farther to find them. And somehow in all of this, the brothers saw him coming or heard or knew that he was coming. And some of them who were very, very jealous of the favor that Joseph had with their father began to plot to murder him. They wanted to kill him. They were tired of him rubbing this in their face, of being the favorite and his fancy coat and his dreams and all of these things. It had just kind of gotten to them to the point that they wanted to kill him. But the oldest, Reuben, I'm going to back up. Reuben, being the oldest brother, knew that he was going to have to go back and face his father and answer to his father. And so he persuaded them, no, don't kill him. Don't harm him. And they came up with another scheme to put him in a well or a cistern, which was just a big tank to hold water, rainwater that they gather to get through dry periods. And there was no water in it at the time, and so they put him in this cistern and just held him there waiting to figure out what they're going to do with him. And while Reuben was evidently gone, some Midianites, or it says, one place it says Ishmaelites. One place it says Ishmaelites, and then another place it refers to them as Midianites. Anyway, they were descendants of Ishmael, so they were like distant cousins, actually, through Abraham and Ishmael, if you remember. They sold him to them as a slave. And then they came up with a scheme to go back and face Jacob and tell him that a wild animal must have killed him on the way, and they found his beautiful robe all covered in blood, which they had actually put the blood on from one of the sheep. They'd killed a sheep, dipped the blood in it, and made it look like Joseph had been attacked by a wild animal and carried away. More deception. So, the way I look at that, Jacob is getting some of his deception brought back to him. He's now the one who's being deceived. And so I'll just pause right there. And part of what I want to talk about this morning is integrity and honesty. And deciding to be a person with integrity, who is a straight shooter, who deals with the truth and is not given to fabricate lies and excuses for your problems. Because that's what this whole family had been doing. They had been scheming against one another and telling lies to one another for a good long while. It became a way of life for them. And Joseph, God wanted to do something different in Joseph. And part of that, the reason is because God had a plan for Joseph's life. And I'll go ahead and reveal the end of the story, he's going to use Joseph to save the nation. But he had a little work to do in Joseph. And so let him put him in the cistern, let him sell him into slavery. I believe that was all part of God's work in Joseph's life to work out that little bit of pride and that arrogance that was in him in order to get him to that place where he could teach him and use him. So Joseph is then sold by the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, to Potiphar. And Potiphar is the captain of Pharaoh's secret guard or bodyguards. He's one of the leaders of the secret service to Pharaoh. And Potiphar brings Joseph into his house, and of course he begins as a servant and doing household chores, but then he notices that Joseph is a good worker, that he's diligent about what he's doing, and that he's responsible, and that he's honest. He always tells the truth. He tells Potiphar the truth about things, and he does things in a right way. And so Potiphar makes him the head steward over his whole household, gives him management. That included the finances. It included being in charge of all the other servants in the house. It included everything about the household business and running of a household except his wife. That was the only thing that was withheld from Joseph, was Potiphar's wife. And then, you know the story. And again, I'm not using a lot of scripture references this morning because these are things that are pretty familiar to most of us, but I want to use the highlights to help make the points that I want to make. He's entrusted with the management of all of Potiphar's household, but then Potiphar's wife, she looks at Joseph and sees that he's a good-looking young man. The Bible even says he was well-built. He's muscular, he's young. He's somewhere between 17 and 25. I'm going to say something like in that range now. And so he's a good-looking young guy, and Potiphar's wife lusts after him and wants to seduce him and tries to get him to come to bed with her. And Joseph puts her off, and then finally she gets angry and mad and jealous, and so she decides to frame him and plot against him, and she screams and yells rape and says that he had tried to rape her. Of course he didn't, but she, being Potiphar's wife, who's going to believe who? Is her word against his, as often is the case. And so Joseph gets sent to prison for that. But lo and behold, when he gets to prison, what does he do? He begins to serve. He begins to take care of other people. He begins to demonstrate compassion and forgiveness and helping the other prisoners. he becomes known as someone who is wise and that can give good advice. And then at some point they even look to him to interpret their dreams. I think they recognize that he spent time with God. It doesn't say that in the Bible, but I believe he had to in order for God to have used him the way he did and to use him prophetically to interpret dreams. I think God had blessed him with that gift, but that came from time alone with God. And of course, he had plenty of time alone in the cistern, and he had time alone now again in prison to just let God work in his heart and his life and his mind. And so there were two other men in the prison, the baker and the cupbearer to Pharaoh. For whatever reason, they had done something that displeased Pharaoh, and he threw them in prison. And they each had dreams, and their dreams were very similar. And they came to Joseph and asked him, what our dreams mean? And Joseph explained to them. And of course, what Joseph prophesied or said was that really the cupbearer was going to get restored, but the baker was going to lose his head. And that's what happened. The cupbearer got restored to being the cupbearer to Pharaoh, and the baker lost his head. Meanwhile, Joseph was left in prison for a couple more years. And he's probably in his mid to late 20s by now, just to give you some context. And Pharaoh begins to have some dreams. Pharaoh has these dreams about fat cows and lean cows. And then he has another dream about corn, grains, heads of corn. And he asked all of the wise men in Egypt, and nobody could interpret his dream. And he had all of the priests of the false gods that they worshipped come and try to interpret. No one could give him an interpretation of the dream. But the cupbearer remembered this guy in prison that he had met who was gifted to interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh said, bring him to me. And Joseph came and interpreted the dream. And the dream had to do with 7 years of plenty and abundance, and then 7 years of famine and drought. And Joseph interpreted and explained all this to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh, through a series of tests and trials, he put Joseph in charge of administering the grain, and then eventually Joseph became ruler of everything in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. He was made manager over all of the business and all of the agriculture and all these things. So I want to say this. God expects us to take care of what he gives us. And he gives us a lot. We are so blessed in this country. Some of us are given more than others. And some people think that's not fair or right, but it is the way of God and it is the way of the earth that some of us will be blessed more than others. But whether we have a lot or we have a little, God expects us to take care of what he gives us and to be good managers. And oftentimes we maybe get caught up in, I'm going to call it the faith movement or whatever. Well, he'll just keep giving me whatever I need. Well, he will, but he expects you to take care of what he gives you so that you don't need so often. Just put it that way. That you are able to learn to be blessed in whatever circumstance you are, whether it's in much or in less or little or few. And so this story of Joseph, he was given 7 years of abundance. Now, they could have just had a big party for 7 years and blown it all. How many of us, the government's handed out quite a bit of money in the last year. And I'm not asking anybody to give me an account, but just think about what did you do with all that money that you weren't expecting that you got from the government this year. Some of us had to have it to live. Some of us needed it to pay rent and buy groceries, I know. Others of us, honestly, didn't really need it. What did we do with it? Did we ask God how to take care of it? Did we ask God what to do with it? See, Joseph, because God had placed him in this place and given him this wisdom and these skills, Joseph knew that they needed to put some of it aside, that they needed to put back over these 7 years enough that they could get by for the next 7 years, because he knew that famine and drought was coming. And that's what he did in his management of Pharaoh's affairs. So we get to the 7 years of drought and famine. Back to Jacob and his 10 rascal sons, 11 altogether, counting Benjamin. And Benjamin's probably a teenager by now, or entering his early 20s. The others are full-grown men with families of their own, wives and concubines of their own. Go back to my chart. Actually, just a little tidbit that when I was rereading some of this. Remember Reuben, the oldest son? After Rachel died when she gave birth to Benjamin, the youngest. She died in childbirth. And Simeon, the oldest son of Leah and Jacob, took Rachel's concubine as his wife. So Rachel's concubine, who was the mother of a couple of those boys, that's how messed up they were. So during the famine, Jacob sends 10 of his sons. He keeps Benjamin, the youngest one, at home because he was the 2 sons that were born to Rachel, his favorite loving wife, Joseph and Benjamin. So now Benjamin is his favorite. Benjamin is the one that he keeps really close and probably overprotects. Doesn't want anything to happen to Benjamin. But he sends the other 10 to Egypt with money, silver, to buy grain to get them through this famine. And so they arrive in Egypt, and they have to face Joseph. And Joseph does not reveal himself to them immediately. I don't know if he is, maybe he's older and just has a beard, and they don't recognize him, but he recognizes his brothers. He knows who they are. And so he decides to test them. They buy the grain. They pay for it with the silver, but then Joseph has his servants put the silver back in the bags and sends them home. But he also tells them, I want to see your younger brother. If what you told me is true, I want you to go home, and I want you to come back and bring your younger brother. Well, they know their father is not going to go for that. So they tell him, and so he keeps Simeon as a captive until they will bring Benjamin for him to see Benjamin. And then they get back home, and they are on the way. They open the sacks of grain, and they find the silver that they had paid. And so now they're going to be accused of stealing, they think. So they go home. They go through that much grain. They need some more. And so now they tell their father, well, we can't go back unless we take Benjamin with us. The man said not to come back unless you bring Benjamin. You won't get any more grain from us. So they had to bring Benjamin. So Jacob tells them, okay, take Benjamin, take the silver that was put in your bags the first time, and take another bunch of silver to pay for the second. So I want you to pay for all this grain that we've been getting. So I don't want this man mad at me. I don't want him to be angry and do something to my beloved son Benjamin. So they convinced Jacob to let them go and take Benjamin. And when they arrive back in Egypt, Joseph receives them this time, and he brings them to his house as guests and makes a big feast for them, and is just feeding and feasting with them and asking them. And he sees that they have Benjamin, and he's inquiring about their father. Is he doing well, and all of this. And so they're making friends again. But then he tests them again with Benjamin, because he wants to keep Benjamin. But then at some point he relents, and he reveals himself and tells them No, I'm not going to keep your brother. I'm not going to make you go home to your father without him. I'm your brother Joseph. And they then, at first they're afraid because they think he's going to take revenge on them for what they've done to him. I mean, they deserve it, right? They had imprisoned him. They had told their father that he had died. They had been mean to him his whole life. And now he is in a position of power. He could kill them. He could imprison them. He could do what he wanted to with them. So they had good reason to be afraid of him. Yet, he did nothing but show them kindness and forgiveness and grace, as is the way of our God. Even when we've done wrong, even when we've misbehaved, when we've been bad, God, in His mercy and in His forgiveness, He forgives and He restores relationships. So Joseph tells Pharaoh at some point, this is my family, these are my brothers, and my father and the rest of the clan are still in Israel. And Pharaoh says, well, send and go get them. In fact, take some carts to haul all their stuff home back and go and bring everybody. Bring your father and bring your brother's wives and children and all the livestock and everything they have, and bring them so that we can take care of them and get through this famine together. Pharaoh so loved and trusted Joseph at this point for what he had done in Egypt, because not only did Joseph save his brothers in Israel, he saved all of Egypt through this. God had used him to that point. And so, Pharaoh really, he was a favored, like a son to Pharaoh. So they send the carts and they bring everyone, 66 persons. I counted through, and then at some point it tells you in the scripture that there were 66 people altogether in the clan at this point, counting the surviving wives and concubines and the sons and their wives and all of their children together, 66 people. And they are given the best of the land of Egypt. And we know that area to be known as Goshen. And, we're kind of setting the stage here. You know what happens down the road here, that they stay there in Egypt and they multiply, and then at some point a new Pharaoh comes along and enslaves all of them, and that leads us up into the time of Moses. Just to set, again, some more context, that this is all prior to that happening, but this is how they ended up in Egypt in the first place. So, in conclusion, what did we learn from Joseph? What can we learn from Joseph's life? How can we model our lives after Joseph, a man, a person of integrity and honesty? Number one, and boy, that's fine on this screen, small print. Your family situation has no bearing on your potential. I know we think it does, but there are too many stories like Joseph, and there are modern day stories. There are today, I can tell you, of young people who were children growing up in the worst of situations, but yet God put His hand in their life, and He brought them up out of some garbage and blessed them and gave them a future and a hope and made them successful in spite of abuse, in spite of divorce, in spite of all the circumstances of their messed up families and their broken lives. God can take anybody and use them and make them into a Joseph, ruler over all of Egypt, ruler over the United States of America, or any nation or any group of people that you want to name. God is able to do that. He is sovereign, and He does choose whom He will bless and do that with, I believe. back to his foreknowledge and his sovereignty, that he puts his hand on children and determines that one's mine, and I'm going to make something out of him. And only I know what I can do with him. Everybody else is not going to see it, but I know what I've got planned for that one. So, let me say this, parents and grandparents. Those little young'uns running around wreaking havoc in your house and making messes and fighting and carrying on and doing all of what they're doing. You don't really know which one necessarily until God shows you which ones he might have his hand on to be somebody. Be careful how you deal with them, because you might end up one day having to face them as Jacob did Joseph, as the brothers did Joseph. Be careful how you deal with them. God is sovereign over the darkest moments in our lives. He is still on the throne. When Joseph was in that dungeon, in that cistern, and when he was in prison, I'm sure he was lonely. I'm sure he felt rejected and felt a lot of hurt and emotion over what his brothers did to him and how he ended up in this place. And he could have, just had a pity party and could have been just wallowing in the mire. But instead, he chose to turn his heart toward the Lord. He chose to look to God to deliver him. He chose to look to God to provide a way out of those circumstances. And so even in the darkest circumstance that you can find yourself in, God is still on the throne. He still has a plan if you are serving him, if you are looking to him, if you are calling on his name. He will answer you and bring you out of that place, no matter where it is. Integrity, which is the main theme of this story to me. What is integrity? I want to define it. It's a decision or a resolve that is made in the heart ahead of time. It's a resolve in your heart, a decision that you make that I will deal honestly with those around me. I will speak the truth even when it causes me hurt, even when it causes me loss, even when it's not to my advantage. I will tell the truth, and I will handle my business truthfully and honestly and ethically. I will do what's right when I'm tempted to do wrong. I've made a decision ahead of time of how I will respond to different circumstances. When that person tempts me with lust, I've already made up my mind what I'm going to do. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to question, should I try to get away with this? No, I've already decided in my heart and in my mind to do what's right before the temptation comes. Joseph had decided and determined to stand righteous before God regardless of his circumstances and regardless of what temptations came to him. We think about the temptation with Potiphar's wife, but what about the money? He had all the money of Potiphar's available to him. You think he might have ever had opportunity to take some for himself or to divert those funds for himself? Sure he did. Or even in Pharaoh's house, he could have, if he was like some of our modern politicians, he would have been figuring out how to fund his retirement while he was there, and make sure that he had something to fall back on in case he lost his favor. No, Joseph chose the way of truth and honesty and integrity and did what was right because he had determined in his heart ahead of time to do what is right. And that way there was no questioning, there was no decision, the temptation did not affect him. Integrity or character truly reveals itself when no one is watching. That is when it really comes out, is how you conduct yourself when there's nobody watching over you. Nobody is supervising you. No one is checking on you, looking over your shoulder or coming behind you. How are you going to do your job? And and this applies at work. I want to say this, no matter what your job is or where you're working, are you giving it your best? Are you doing quality work even when no one is looking, or even seems like no one cares? Are you still doing your best even though no one is telling you how good you're doing? They're not giving you praise, or they're not rewarding you. They're not giving you bonuses, whatever. Do you decide to go ahead and do excellent work anyway, even when it's of no benefit to yourself? That's integrity. That's the kind of person Joseph was, and that's the kind of person that I want to be. Determined to trust and serve God and be faithful where you are now, regardless of personal consequences. Regardless of the consequences to yourself, that you've determined that you're going to serve God and that you're going to live a life of integrity and honesty. Being faithful in small things brings more responsibility for bigger things. God intends for us to be good stewards of everything entrusted to us. As I mentioned before, if you make $8 an hour or you make $150,000 a year, are you taking care of what you have given? Are you taking care of what you have, of what God has enabled you to do? Are you doing whatever it is that you're called to do with excellence, regardless of how much you are rewarded for it? There's a parable that Jesus told about the workers, that he came in the morning and he hired some people to work, and then he came at noon and hired some more people to work, and then he came in the afternoon, hired some more people to work, and he paid them all the same. And some of them said, well, that's not fair. Well, no, it wasn't fair, but it was his money to do as he pleased, to give to whom he wanted to give to. Being poorly treated, or being treated poorly by others, is no excuse to retaliate or abuse your authority over those who have wronged you. That's our human nature, isn't it? Is to want to retaliate, to want to make them pay when they've done something wrong to us. But Joseph didn't. He didn't retaliate against his brothers. He didn't make them suffer the way he suffered. Oh, he tested them. He wanted to test them to see if they would do the right thing, and to see if his father, would have them do the right thing. But he didn't retaliate. He forgave. And I think that brings me to my last point. Forgiveness keeps our hearts pure before God and allows him to use us to our fullest potential. If we're carrying unforgiveness, it will hold you back. It's not hurting the people you're not forgiving. They sometimes don't even know. They're not even aware. But it's going to hold you back. It is going to keep you tangled up in that hurt and in that problem from the past and that wrongdoing. It's going to keep you bound up and so paralyzed in that junk that you will not be able to go forward into what God has for you. If Joseph had stayed bitter and just wallowed up in all of his pity over what his brothers did to him, he would not have made it to where he was ruler over Potiphar's house and ultimately all of Egypt. He would have just been another slave who was angry and bitter and, violent probably, and would have ended up dead, very likely. But instead, he chose to conduct himself differently in spite of the circumstances. Holding grudges will hold us in the past and keep us from moving forward. How many of us have some kind of grudge that we've held on to? And I just can't forgive that. I just can't forget that. I can't let it go. What they did was wrong and they deserve to pay. And so if we learn anything this morning from Joseph, that holding grudges is not hurting anyone but yourself. And it's going to keep you from being all that God wants you to be. It's going to keep you from being able to move forward into the blessings and the place of favor that he wants to put you in. Amen? If you would stand, and just ask you to meditate on these things this week. I'd challenge you to go back and read that section of Genesis. It's about 10 chapters from chapter 30 to chapter 40, because there's a lot I could not even possibly begin to cover that happened in there that gives you a lot of foundational context for the nation of Israel, and also explains much of what happened in the rest of the Bible if you understand what was going on in that section there.